Hey everybody and welcome back. I have a fun topic for this video. We're going to be taking a look at a bunch of cards that the community and I thought would be really good before and around the beginning of Beyond the Gates that just haven't lived up to the hype over time. I think our initial impressions were all justified because many of these cards would be crazy good in other very similar games. But today I'll be sharing with you what I've learned from playtesting and gaining a better understanding of Altered about why each of these cards just doesn't fit well into the Beyond the Gates and Trial by Frost versions of Altered. Hopefully these tips can prepare you to better separate the staples from the duds in the future. Make sure to like and subscribe for more helpful content, and with that, let's take a look at the first card that surprised me. I really thought originally that Athena was going to be super good since it can essentially give you infinite resources, and it seemed like a 3/4/4 for 3 was actually going to be really good. But I think we've started to realize that 3/4/4 for 3 is actually just alright, and also it's just way harder to get 2 landmarks into play than I ever expected. I think I thought we were going to have a lot of really good landmarks revealed, but a lot of them are just too expensive or just a little too inconsistent to always get 2 of them out there. So yeah, I think that this just hasn't worked as well as I expected. Also, there are just a lot of stronger alternatives. You don't really want to be playing this Athena 3/4/4 over and over again. You'd actually rather just be playing your really strong cards back to back instead that give you like better value for the cost. And so, yeah, I think a lot of these cards, like you're seeing here on the screen, you can just chain them into each other and play a lot of cheaper cards, which lets you be more reactive, or even just things like Frankenstein, which have like a better cost to stat ratio. And yeah, stuff like this has just proved to be way better, especially in Trace, which was like probably the Axiom hero to be the most prominent thus far. Especially at the height of Trace's power, I feel like it was just so easy to keep your resources flowing that you didn't even really need that Athena every day. The next card's going to be Keylon Cylinder. This honestly seemed like it would be so good. A 1-cost 1/1/1 from hand, and then it basically gives you a 1/1/1 every day for the rest of the game as well. But honestly, from playtesting, most of the time I'm just tapping just to get 2 more counters because that 1/1/1 isn't enough to make a difference. And also, it's just really sad that the hero that wants to play permanents the most only benefits from cards that cost 3 or more that are permanent. Keylon Cylinder just didn't quite have a place. It doesn't have synergy with Sierra, which means you're going to be discarding it from your reserve later when you play a more expensive permanent. And in Traced and Subhash, the best thing you can do with your permanent zones is put 2 Havens in them. Haven is probably getting an errata within like about a week or so of me posting this video, but at least in the past, you were able to cycle your deck so consistently that in quite a bit of your games, maybe at least half of them, you'd see the double Haven, and so it didn't really make sense to spend a rare slot on this Keylon Cylinder that you'd eventually be discarding. Maybe now, honestly, if like Haven's nerf is pretty severe, there might be some room for something like Keylon Cylinder to sneak back into Traced or Subhash decks. The next cards I want to look at are kind of like a pair here. We've got Ozma and Physical Training. Card advantage is so important in Altered. I think compared to like most of the games I've played, your resources are just so thin all the time. And so your top decks are really important in like every decision you make. And so you'd think Physical Training and Ozma would be insane, getting a card both times they're played and not really giving up anything in stats. Baba Yaga sees play in both of its rare forms, and all that does is draw you 1 card. Honestly, both of these cards give you better stats for the cost and draw you 2 cards. But in practice, they just don't work as well as you'd think. For Ozma specifically, it's just a lot harder to get 2 boosted characters into play than it is to just have like 3 characters in play for like the common Ordis one. That's another card that is possibly getting an errata, and it's crazy that that one's getting an errata and then this one doesn't even see play. But yeah, by the time you can have 2 boosted cards in play before this comes out, you have quite a bit of mana, making this kind of like not good early on, which isn't really what you want for your rares in your decks. So somehow, even though the condition doesn't seem that bad, it's just been a little too hard to pull off in the decks that are popular so far. And Physical Training, it brings in a big problem for a lot of cards that we'll see on this list, where if you commit too heavily to one character in Altered right now, it's just so easy for your opponent to like hit you with an Off You Go, hit you with a Teamwork Training, and remove that buffed up character or that expensive character you played for a very low amount of mana. And so, yeah, I think that's honestly the biggest thing holding physical training back. It's so much better to play a separate body with something like Baba Yaga because you can put it in either expedition instead of maybe having to commit to the only expedition you have a character with physical training, and it's just going to be less susceptible to the removal. And so while, yeah, physical training has seen at least some play and probably will continue to in the future and might even get like better. So while I would still say that both of these cards are good, I just have been surprised how they haven't been quite as good as some of the other draw cards in the set. People often opt just to play like the rare Mighty Djinn instead because the ramping and things fit your game plan, and then you can just get like a free draw on the first play as well. Technically too, if you don't ramp with this, it can be 2 draws. And recently people are also just committing their rare slots to things like Axiom Salvager, which also can be like a really good day 1 play that later gives you a little bit of card advantage. The next card I want to look at is Atlas. This one definitely suffers from the threat of like removal, things like Sticky Note and stuff, being able to take this out. It's definitely a problem. Teamwork Training too, for just 2 mana, can remove this pretty easily. It's not that hard for like Sigismar or something to get 5 characters out. And then also, the biggest payoff from this is when you play it the second time, but there's a ton of sabotage and things like Tooth Fairy flying around that can get rid of this. This was pretty strong in the Exalted meta before we had all the cards, but now I just think there's too many answers and it's not quite powerful enough. And 2, a lot of times, even if you buff this up pretty big, if your opponent just commits to one side, you're just going 1-to-1 anyway. And so it's really just not giving you as much advantage as you'd need out of a card that's both a rare and only good in the late game. Another card that I'm a little disappointed in is Bravos Vanguard. This seems like it's doing so much, so you'd think it'd have to be good. It has resource advantage by removing fleeting, and it gives something a boost. That's a total of 5/3/3 in stats for 3, which seems pretty good. And there's not even really any anti-synergy in the faction for this. Theoretically, you might not want to play this on your Seringer because you just want to get a draw, but pretty much every other card in all of the Bravo stacks would be happy to lose fleeting. But honestly, probably the biggest thing that kept this out of scene play is just that there are cheaper options that can do similar things, and in Altered, it's just proved to be so important to be able to make a lot of plays each day, because if you run out of mana first, your opponent can suddenly be completely reactive and often commit less than you did because they know which side to go to, and then maybe even like bank some advantage by setting up permanents and things moving into the next day. So in the past, Helping Hand was just able to do everything that Vanguard did while being on a cheaper card, and Chiron can also trigger your boost and things while being on a 2 cost, which you can also combo with your 1 drops as early as day 1. And yeah, I guess things like that have just proved to be a little bit better. The first card for Lyra I was surprised about is the rare Mighty Djinn. I was pretty surprised about this because the Bravos version frequently sees play in all 3 heroes, but for Lyra, this card has just been a little bit weaker than I expected. I think there are often better things that you can be doing for 4. A lot of people just set up cards like Aloe Vera instead for 4, and it kind of feels like that anchored body and the card advantage you get out of it is actually worth more to you than having that extra mana. Also, there are just a ton of cards in Lyra that give you the ability to make the next card you play cost 1 less, and while that isn't quite as good as having a mana for the rest of the game, a lot of those cards are also just a lot stronger on the front end, where Mighty Djinn can kind of be a little bit of a liability and hard to set up. I definitely think Mighty Djinn will see some play at some point in the future, but yeah, for now it's just kind of being outshined by a lot of these other cards. I was also kind of surprised Lyric Cloth Dancer hasn't been that powerful, but I feel like a lot of times now, since you play cards from the reserve and hand, you're only often giving 1 card fleeting with this, at which point you might as well just be playing the common. It even has better stats. And one of the biggest things too is Fenn's been consistently the most powerful Lyra hero for the first 2 expansions. And with this hero, if you resupply into your Cloth Dancer, you don't get the effect at all. It's just a 0/2/2 for 2, which is really bad. So yeah, honestly, even things like Tanuki and a lot of other cards that only get their effects from hand have not been as good as they might be, just because Fenn's pretty much the top dog for Lyra. Also, once again, we see cheaper cards with similar effects kind of outshining their more expensive counterparts. If people wanted the effect to give fleeting, they've usually turned to acapella training. If you need to hit multiple cards like you'd want to do with Cloth Dancer, you can just play it twice that same day. But if not, you can just spread it out over multiple days, and acapella training also just does a great job of being an after you as well. Moving to Muna, Daughter of Yggdrasil just seemed so wild when we had a very limited card pool. 553 for 3 was just absolutely bonkers, but nowadays with more cards revealed, Lyra Thespian is a 444 for 2, and that's honestly probably a better rate, and it's also cheaper, which we've already established is really important in Altered. So I think that Daughter of Yggdrasil, which is kind of supposed to have a bit of a drawback with this effect that gives your opponent a card, doesn't even have like the best stats to cost ratio, so it just hasn't been that playable. In a lot of other games I've played, both players have very full hands, so giving your opponent a draw as well like isn't that big of a deal. I was kind of thinking that cheating the stats per mana was going to be more important than like the resource gain, but that's not really turned out to be how Altered plays. A lot of decks sacrifice stats instead to be able to get additional resources and tempo, because when you're playing so many cheap cards, you kind of need to refill your hand to keep your gas going. And so yeah, I think that this ability here to give both players a card is way worse than I ever expected, because there are actually just so many games where your opponent's low on resources, and because they're like one card shy, you'll get like a free win because they just can't even use all their mana on like the last or second to last day. So yeah, I just feel like I'd never want to run Daughter of Yggdrasil anymore, because it kind of takes away that opportunity for your opponent to have a bad draw if they have like poor deck building or make bad mana decisions. Instead, when people want resources for themselves, they're just leaning on things like Spindle Harvesters, which you can anchor and then maybe even re-anchor and just get multiple resupplies that are only for you and not helping your opponent. Once again, here we're just seeing a really cheap card being really good, and then yeah, this one is just kind of one-sided instead, which is what you'd want to see for a draw engine. Another card that seemed pretty crazy was the Hydrocana, but after playing a lot of games of Altered, I've realized that there really is a clock on this game. In other games with combat and things, if you choose not to like engage with your opponent, you can just like both build up your resources and prolong the game for as long as you want. But in Altered, someone's pretty much winning each side every day, which means you only really have 6 to 7 days until the game's going to be over pretty much every time. And so with that clock on the game, even though Hydrocana seems crazy, it's just only hitting the board for a couple days at the end. I think that if you added like even just one more day on average with like one more expedition zone in the middle to the games of Altered, this card would suddenly be a lot better. I think that it's about equally good on 7 mana to just play a couple cards, including one anchored character, because you don't really need the 888 in stats the next day to win that side. Even if you just start with like a Dracana or an Aloe Vera, you're already having a little bit more advantage than your opponent, which is going to encourage them to play the other side anyway. So yeah, honestly, banking any advantage is usually enough, but a lot of these other cards let you possibly even like 2-0 your opponent on 7 mana going into the next day instead of maybe being the one getting 2-0'd. And with the Spindle Muna Bastion being really popular, you can basically give tough to all of your characters, so you don't necessarily need like Hydra to punish maybe decks that are really heavy on removal. Another card that just blew my mind when I realized it wasn't good is Bountiful Meadow. Being able to cheat the mana system is like the greatest thing in any game. There are so many powerful and famous cards that just let you get one extra mana for the rest of the game, and that's so good. But Altered is really just a different beast than every other game out there. In a lot of these games where you take a turn and then your opponent takes a turn, really expensive cards are really good because you don't really care about prolonging your day and how long it takes. You just care about doing the strongest thing. And oftentimes that's the most expensive card in your hand. And so being able to ramp up to these expensive cards that unlock effects that aren't available to you until you can get X amount of mana, that's just so important. But in Altered, the first day is as important as the last day. It doesn't matter if you win an expedition on day 1 with a 1/1, or if you win one on the end of the game with like 20 worth of stats, that's equally good. And so, yeah, I just feel like effects that ramp mana so far, while sometimes they've been all right, they've been far from mandatory or like the strongest thing going around. For mana channeling or the common bountiful meadow as well, all of these cards only get played once compared to most cards being played twice in Altered. This means these cards all essentially have an additional cost of losing half a card that you don't see when playing their counterparts in other games. And especially when the big card you ramp into can't one-shot your opponent and you'll have to play several more days, those resources start to be really important. At some point, I'm sure we'll get enough draw or medium weight cards to support ramp like this, but they just haven't been good enough in the first 2 expansions. Also, especially because this takes a rare slot, that's just competing with a lot of things. This works in bureaucrat decks, which means Waru, but basically every one of the bureaucrats in their rare form costs 1 less, which basically does the same thing as Bountiful Meadow. It lets you cheat the mana system by 1 the day it's played from hand and the second time it's played from reserve. And so if you think about it, you have to exhaust Bountiful Meadow 4 times just to kind of break even, twice to pay for its own cost, and then 2 more times to be able to even out with just like playing one of these rares that also saves you 2 mana. So at that point, it's like, unless you draw Bountiful Meadow really early, it's not doing much more for you than just having like one of these other bureaucrats in your deck as a rare. And also, when the game is so tight, like we've talked about for resources, Bountiful Meadow is just such a terrible top deck. And so I think, yeah, a lot of these cards on the left have just been proving to be better. They are just bodies with stats so that, like, when you're top decking or in a bad situation where you just got sabotaged, you can at least put something into the expeditions. On the topic of bureaucrats, I was also pretty surprised that the council really hasn't had a time to shine yet. This card is really good against Muna, where like every card anchors himself on play or gets boost or something. But honestly, most of the popular decks in Beyond the Gates and now just play a ton of cards that aren't impacted by this whatsoever. A lot of the strongest cards in the game have effects that happen when you do something, not on play. And so these crazy uniques and rares like Kadigger and Mage Dancer that are triggering multiple times a turn can just completely ignore the council. You also just have a ton of cards that are stat sticks like Ordis Trooper that could care less, or Hathor, which get their benefit from a support ability, which isn't blocked at all by the council. And another card that's just underperformed is Anubis. Honestly, the biggest reason that this card hasn't done anything yet is Sigismar's been pretty much on top from the beginning. I feel like it's always been a top 3 to 5 hero. And when about a third of the decks you face in any given tournament are Sigismar, Anubis is pretty much completely worthless. It's just going to come down and remove a 1/1/1 from your opponent, which is the same value as what you're tributing. If I assume you're probably playing this in like Sigismar yourself. And so, yeah, at that point, it's just not doing what it's designed to do, which is let you tribute something weak to take out something big from your opponent. I think this card could definitely work eventually, but it's going to have to be at a time when Sigismar is unpopular and you won't face other opponents using that hero. Yeah, but for now, this just hasn't been able to do anything. A lot stronger is just something like teamwork training where you can pick the target. Even though it doesn't put a body into play, you can just make sure that you're actually taking out a valuable resource from your opponent. And for the last faction for Yzmir, I was pretty surprised that a lot of powerful rare characters like Bravos Blade Dancer and even Sneezer Shroom more recently haven't been performing that well. It seems great to drop this 1/1/1 boosted up, and then the second day when you play it, it's going to be a lot bigger, and if you have like a helping hand to combo with it, it'll just keep growing from there. But in reality, there are just too many cards that are fighting for your attention in Ephanis. With higher priority targets like Kadigger and Mage Dancer and your uniques, you just don't have the boost to also place on Bravos Blade Dancer at the same time. And so things like it and Sneezer Shroom I feel like have started to get cut. Yeah, because if you aren't putting the additional boost on the Blade Dancer, it's only around a common power level and it's just not worth running in your deck. And so even though the potential there seems really good, there are just too many other cards that are better to combo with things like Helping Hand. Also, your unique slots can only be characters. And in Ephanis, there really has to be like a perfect balance between your characters and spells. And I feel like the optimal ratio is a little bit more spells than characters. And so, yeah, there's just already plenty of mandatory characters to run, and you'd rather save all of the rest of your rare slots for really powerful spells instead. And speaking of powerful spells, Kraken's Wrath just hasn't proved to be one. It has the problem we talked about of just not being as good as cheaper, similar cards. Off you go. It can take out one threat for 2 mana, and while you can maybe take out like 3, maybe if you're really lucky 4 for 5 with Kraken's Wrath, the 2 cost off you go has just been good enough. Also, having fleeting I do think is a pretty big downside. It's really important right now to bounce the cards that are in your reserve for Yzmir. And so maybe in the future that like might not be the case, but for now you really like those spells that you can have go to reserve and then return to your hand again. I also feel like Kraken's Wrath has just been power creeped already with Blizzard. This card's a common that costs the same, and it can send each character from target expedition to reserve. So even if your opponent has cards costing more than 6 in one expedition, you can still send them to reserve with Blizzard. While Kraken's Wrath might be able to let you cheese out a win on both sides at times, I think that most often you're only able to win one side and Blizzard's just as good. Also, Tough has really started to become a problem for heroes like Akisha, especially with things like the Spindle Muna Bastion. Kraken's Wrath has to pay the Tough cost every time, which can get ridiculous and makes the card almost unplayable, but magically Blizzard has no additional cost to play it because it targets the expedition instead of the characters. So yeah, while Kraken's Wrath seemed pretty crazy in starter decks and things, I think there's just a lot more going for a card like Blizzard these days. And we've seen other really powerful spells get printed as well. Even though this is in a different faction, Avalanche is honestly pretty similar to Kraken's Wrath. Both of them here taking a rare slot, but this one costs 2 less. It can send any number of target characters with 5 or less in total mountain to the reserve. While you might not be able to remove quite as much stuff from the board, having a cheaper cost on this does let you see more of the cards your opponent's going to play before you trigger it, and it can often still take out like 3 characters and stuff as well for a 3-cost removal spell. So yeah, I don't know. I just only really expect us to keep getting more and more spells like Blizzard and Avalanche, and I don't know if Kraken's Wrath will have a chance to shine. If it ever does, it's going to be in a meta with pretty like powerful tokens because those have a cost of 0, but for now that's just not what we're seeing. And the next card that I just never expected would be basically seeing 0 play in all of its versions is Meditation Training. I especially thought that this was going to be good in Yzmir, where you could bounce it back to your hand and kind of get like infinite anchored characters. That's like an eternal character and you can do it so early, but it really goes to the problem in Altered of if you commit too many resources into one character, your opponent can just use a cheap removal on it and they trade super favorably into you. And so I think people have just realized it's better for me to just play another body out or to get rid of something my opponent's played or draw a card even than to like anchor that big guy I have on the board, because your opponent already wants to remove your biggest character, and once you anchor it, it's just like overcommitting and like setting yourself up to lose in a deck that usually is just like so favored into your opponent. Yeah, people just prefer to run cards that are good kind of at all stages of the game. You see all these crazy powerful cards on the right, and I mean, one other thing to note is all of the cards on the right cost half as much as Meditation Training. So it's just kind of more proof that cheap cards are just so good. When you play these cards on the right, since they're cheaper, maybe you can get your opponent to run out of mana before you drop them, where if you commit a Meditation Training, your opponent might be the one getting the last word in. But yeah, if we had like 21 rares or something, I'm sure Meditation Training would be seen play in some decks, but it's just always been on the outside a little bit with so many more powerful spells competing against it. If there's ever a time where removals fall out of favor, and in like some matchups you can play meditation training comfortably knowing your opponent won't have an answer. I'm sure it'll find a place in the meta because it is really strong, but yeah, it's just way too risky for now. Let me know what you think in the comments. I really like to hear your thoughts. Have you been surprised that even just 3-cost cards can be too expensive because it's so important to delay your turn as long as possible? And have you noticed how the tight resources game and threat of powerful removals just completely warps deck building? And what other cards did you think would be good from the first expansion that have disappointed you? I really want to keep this conversation going. If you made it to the end of the video, make sure to like and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching.